Hi, I'm Julie with Annie's Heirloom Seeds, and today we're going to be making a delicious squash soup. Squash soup really has only two main ingredients, your squash and your onions. What squash should you pick? It really depends on what you have. You can use any winter squash, and they all are delicious, but I like to look for one that has a thick flesh. That's just because it's easier to work with. If it's got a really thin flesh, you're going to spend a lot of time peeling and getting the squash that you need. I like to start off by peeling up my squash and cubing it up and setting it aside. How much? Depends how much soup you want to make. The proportions are really up to you. The other ingredient that I like to use is an onion. I like to cut the onion into an average sized dice. If you cut it too large, it's going to take longer to cook. Now to start, I like to saute my onions in some oil in a pan. Now, how long do you cook the onions? I like to cook the onions until they're a nice golden brown. This is because that provides umami to my dish. Umami is the mouthfeel. It's like a richness and a fullness to your soup or your food that you're cooking. Now, this is usually accomplished by making a meat stock or using meat. But I usually forget to thaw some stock, or maybe I'm making a vegetarian meal. So I like to use onions in this case. If you brown the onions, it provides that richness that meat does. And you can have that wonderful, rich flavored soup that doesn't feel thin and watery if you brown your onions first. So now we've browned our onions. After the onions are browned, I like to add my cubed squash, a little salt, and then I cover with water just to the top of the squash or a little under. That seems to be the right amount of liquid. Now you bring it to a boil, turn the heat down, and then simmer, usually covered, until the squash is soft. That can take about 10 minutes on some squash. It can take 20 on some of the others. Just use a fork to see if it's tender. I usually salt my squash soup while I'm cooking it. That's because when it's cooked with the salt, it kind of infuses it better and it gets a better flavor. After your squash is soft, it's time to puree. You have a couple options for pureeing. You could just use a potato masher. That'll get most of it and you'll have more of a rustic soup with more chunks in it. I like to use an immersion stick blender. You could use a regular blender, but then you have the problem of really hot soup in your blender, and that can splatter and be a little dangerous. With the immersion stick blender, you stick your blender in and just buzz it up some, and it'll puree up your squash. The more you do it, the smoother it's going to be. This usually leaves a few chunks and some rustic flavors in it too, texture. Now, I just salt to taste, and you have a finished, delicious squash soup. Now you can make a few variations on the squash soup that really whatever you want to do works. I like to make a curry squash soup, and for that I add a little curry powder with the squash when I cook the squash, and I replace half the water or some of the water with coconut milk. Then you get a wonderful coconut curry squash soup. I've also made a roasted pepper and Mexican-inspired squash soup. You could add some ancho and cumin and maybe a little garlic with your squash. And then I like to put roasted peppers, either hot or sweet, and maybe some pumpkin seeds in at the end. Another wonderful one would be to make more of a pumpkin squash soup and add some cinnamon and ginger and nutmeg and whatever warming spices to make kind of a Christmassy squash soup. Really, whatever sounds good to you, give it a try. Make your own wonderful, delicious squash soup.